My dad's fist connected with my face so hard that I saw stars dancing across my vision like broken fireworks. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth as 50 guests at my brother Dylan's military promotion party watched in horrified silence. Before I could even process what had happened, his calloused fingers tangled in my auburn hair, yanking me toward the front door like I was nothing more than a piece of garbage to be discarded. Dylan actually started clapping, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet as he shouted, "You had it coming, Patsy!" Not one person moved to help me. Not his commanding officer, not our neighbors, not even Mom. But they had no idea what I'd been recording on my phone, and they definitely didn't know about the one call I was about to make that would turn their entire world into ashes. 8 months earlier, I'd made what I thought was the most compassionate decision of my life. My father Martin had suffered a serious back injury on a construction site, leaving him unable to work and drowning in medical bills. Mom Sandra was struggling to keep up with the mortgage payments on their modest ranch house in suburban Denver, and the stress was eating away at both of them like acid. As a software engineer making 6 figures at a tech startup downtown, I felt obligated to step in and help the people who had raised me. I moved out of my comfortable apartment near downtown and back into the cramped basement bedroom where I'd spent my teenage years. The walls were still covered with my old college acceptance letters and achievement awards, faded reminders of dreams that seemed so much simpler back then. Every month, I transferred $3,000 to their joint account to cover the mortgage, utilities, groceries, and Dad's prescription medications. I told myself it was temporary just until Dad could get back on his feet or figure out some kind of disability arrangement. My brother Dylan had been deployed overseas for 2 years, serving as a lieutenant in the Army's logistics division somewhere in Eastern Europe. We video called maybe once every few months, and he always seemed distracted, more interested in talking to Mom and Dad than catching up with me. When news came through that he'd been promoted to captain and would be coming home for a 2-week leave, the whole family buzzed with excitement. Mom spent weeks planning the perfect celebration party. She ordered custom decorations in military green and gold, hired a caterer for fancy appetizers, and invited everyone from our old neighborhood, along with several of Dylan's military colleagues who were stationed at nearby bases. The guest list grew to 50 people, including Colonel Harrison Dillon's commanding officer, who had driven 3 hours from Fort Carson just to attend the celebration. I helped Mom with all the preparations, from hanging streamers in the backyard to arranging folding chairs around rented tables. Dad seemed more energetic than he'd been in months, actually getting out of his recliner to help move furniture and set up the sound system. For the first time since his accident, our family felt united around something positive instead of constantly worrying about bills and medical appointments. The morning of the party, I was in the kitchen arranging catered sandwiches on serving platters when I heard Dylan and Dad talking in hushed voices on the back porch. Their conversation had an urgent quality that made me pause in my sandwich arranging. Through the screen door, I could make out fragments of their discussion words like inheritance and paperwork and pressure her while everyone's watching. My stomach dropped as I realized they were talking about Grandma Rose's property. She had passed away 6 months ago, leaving me a small ranch house on 5 acres about an hour outside Denver. I hadn't done anything with the inheritance yet because the probate process was still working its way through the legal system, and honestly, I'd been too busy supporting my parents financially to focus on my own future plans. But apparently Dylan and Dad had been focusing on it plenty. As I stood frozen in the kitchen listening to their scheming voices drift through the screen door, Dylan said something that made my blood run cold. She's been supporting them all this time, so she obviously cares about family. We just need to make her understand that selling Grandma's place is the right thing to do. Once she signs the papers tonight, we can have the whole thing settled by next week. Dad's gravelly voice responded, "I've already talked to a realtor. Property values in that area have gone up significantly. We're looking at least $300,000, maybe more. That'll cover all our medical bills and give us enough left over to fix up this place. And she won't refuse if we do it publicly," Dylan added with a confidence that made me feel sick. "She's always been the people pleaser of the family, Put her on the spot in front of 50 people, including my commanding officer, and she'll cave immediately rather than cause a scene. I carefully set down the sandwich platter and backed away from the screen door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My own brother and father were planning to manipulate me into giving away my inheritance by using emotional blackmail and public pressure. They'd turn my generous support of the family into a weapon against me, twisting my kindness into evidence that I owed them even more. The realization hit me like a physical blow. All those months of sacrificing my independence and financial security hadn't been seen as loving support. In their minds, it was just proof that I could be counted on to give them whatever they wanted whenever they asked for it. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the backyard was filled with the cheerful chaos of 50 guests celebrating Dylan's military achievement. Colonel Harrison arrived in his dress uniform, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made everyone stand a little straighter when he entered a room. He spent time talking with Dad about military history and asking thoughtful questions about Dylan's service record. The Johnson family from next door brought their famous potato salad and spent most of the party comparing notes with Mom about neighborhood gossip. Mrs. Johnson kept commenting on how proud everyone was of Dylan's success and how wonderful it was to see our family doing so well despite Dad's challenges with his injury. Dylan's military colleagues formed their own cluster near the beer cooler, sharing stories about base life and deployment experiences. Captain Rodriguez, a fellow logistics officer, entertained the group with impressions of their shared commanding officers, while Sergeant Martinez showed off pictures of his new baby daughter on his phone. I moved through the party like an actress playing a role, smiling and making small talk while internally preparing for whatever confrontation Dylan and Dad had planned. Every time I caught sight of them exchanging meaningful glances across the yard, my anxiety ratcheted up another notch. Dylan looked impressive in his dress blues, all polished brass buttons and crisp creases. He'd always been the family's golden child even before his military service, but the uniform seemed to amplify that specialness in everyone's eyes. Neighbors who barely acknowledged me when I lived at home now hung on his every word about military life and international relations. When Dylan stepped onto the makeshift stage Dad had built from shipping pallets, the entire party fell silent with anticipation. He cleared his throat and began what should have been a simple thank you speech to the gathered guests. "I want to thank everyone for coming out today to celebrate this promotion with me." He began, his voice carrying easily across the backyard. "Military service teaches you a lot about sacrifice and commitment, but it also teaches you about the importance of family support." His eyes found mine in the crowd, and something cold flickered across his expression. Some families make individual sacrifices so that one member can succeed and bring honor to everyone. My promotion to captain wouldn't have been possible without the many sacrifices that have been made on my behalf. The guests nodded along with his words, probably assuming he was talking about Dad's support during his childhood or Mom's care packages during deployment. But I could see the calculated look in his eyes as he continued building toward whatever trap he and Dad had prepared. "In fact," Dylan continued, his voice gaining momentum, "my sister Patsy has been making incredible sacrifices to support our family during Dad's recovery from his workplace injury. She's been covering all our household expenses for 8 months now, proving that when one family member succeeds, we all benefit from lifting each other up." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Several neighbors turned to smile at me, clearly impressed by my dedication to family. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly, probably thinking about military values like loyalty and service to others. But Dylan wasn't finished. His voice took on a more formal tone as he continued. "Which is why I'm so pleased to announce that Patsy has decided to make an additional generous family contribution by transferring our grandmother's inherited property to help cover our parents' ongoing medical expenses and necessary home improvements." My mouth dropped open in shock. He just announced a decision I'd never made to 50 people, including his commanding officer and our entire neighborhood. The crowd erupted in applause, with people turning to beam at me like I was some kind of saint. Mrs. Johnson actually started crying, telling anyone who would listen what a wonderful daughter I was. Colonel Harrison walked over to shake my hand, expressing his admiration for family loyalty and sacrifice. Several of Dylan's military colleagues raised their beer bottles in a toast to family dedication. I stood frozen in the middle of the celebration, feeling like I was drowning while everyone else cheered. When I tried to catch Dylan's eye to signal my confusion and growing anger, he just smiled back at me with the kind of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. Then Dad appeared at my elbow carrying a manila folder thick with legal documents. His smile was warm and paternal, the kind of expression that would look perfectly loving to anyone watching from a distance. But when he leaned close to speak in my ear, his voice carried an undertone that made me understand this had moved far beyond family discussion into something much more dangerous. "Here are all the transfer papers," he said quietly, his breath hot against my ear. "I've already filled out everything except your signature. All you have to do is sign on the highlighted lines and we can get this settled tonight while everyone's here to witness your generous decision." My hands trembled as I opened the folder and saw page after page of legal documents transferring ownership of Grandma Rose's property from me to our parents. The paperwork was incredibly detailed and professional looking, clearly prepared by an actual lawyer rather than something Dad had downloaded from the internet. But as I scanned through the documents, something made my blood freeze. On the final page in the section where my signature was supposed to go, someone had already forged my name in careful handwriting that looked remarkably similar to my actual signature. "Dad," I whispered, staring at the forged signature, "what is this?" He glanced down at the documents and his face went pale as he realized I'd discovered their backup plan. "Oh, that's just a placeholder," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "The lawyer said to fill in everything so we'd know where you needed to sign." But I was already flipping through the other pages, discovering that my forged signature appeared in several other locations throughout the paperwork. This wasn't a placeholder or a template. This was a complete set of transfer documents ready to be filed with or without my actual consent. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. Dylan and Dad hadn't just planned to pressure me into signing over my inheritance. They'd prepared to steal it outright if their manipulation tactics didn't work. I closed the manila folder and looked up at Dad with what I hoped was a calm expression, even though my heart was racing like I'd just sprinted up a mountain. Around us, the party continued with guests chatting happily about Dylan's promotion and my supposed generosity with the family inheritance. "Dad, I need some time to review these documents more carefully," I said, keeping my voice level and reasonable. "This is a significant legal decision, and I want to make sure I understand all the implications before I sign anything." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his paternal smile for the benefit of anyone watching our conversation. "Honey, there's really nothing complicated about it. You're just transferring the property to help your family during a difficult time. Everyone here thinks it's a beautiful gesture." "I understand that," I replied, "but I'd still prefer to have my own lawyer review everything before making such a major financial decision. I'm sure you can appreciate wanting to be thorough with something this important." That's when Dylan materialized beside us, apparently having noticed that the signing ceremony wasn't proceeding according to their script. His captain's uniform made him look older and more authoritative than the brother I remembered, and he used that authority like a weapon as he joined our conversation. "Is there some kind of problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough edge to make several nearby guests turn their attention toward us. I thought we'd already discussed this as a family. "We haven't discussed anything," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "This is actually the first I'm hearing about transferring Grandma Rose's property, and I'd like some time to consider all my options before making such a significant decision." Dylan's expression darkened. "Your options, Patsy. Our parents are drowning in medical debt because Dad got hurt trying to provide for this family. You've been living here rent-free for 8 months while they struggle to keep up with basic expenses. How is honoring Grandma Rose's memory by helping her son not an obvious choice?" His words stung because they contained just enough truth to make me doubt myself. I had been living in their basement and I had been watching them struggle with financial stress. But I'd also been paying $3,000 every month to support them, sacrificing my own independence and financial security to help them through Dad's recovery. I've been contributing $3,000 every month, I said, hoping to remind him of my ongoing support. I'm not unwilling to help the family. I just want to make informed decisions about major financial commitments. $3,000 a month that you'll get back eventually, Dylan shot back. You have a great job and no real expenses since you're living here. Meanwhile, Dad's medical bills are piling up and this house is falling apart around us. The roof needs replacing, the furnace is on its last legs, and Mom can barely afford groceries some weeks. Colonel Harrison had drifted closer to our conversation, probably curious about the shift in tone from celebration to what was beginning to sound like a family dispute. His presence made Dylan straighten his shoulders and project even more authority into his voice. "Captain Brennan," the colonel said politely, "is everything all right here?" "Yes, sir," Dylan replied immediately. "We were just finalizing some family business related to supporting our parents during Dad's medical recovery. My sister was about to sign some paperwork to help with their expenses." The way he phrased it made it sound like I was being unreasonably difficult about a decision that was already settled. I could see the colonel's confusion as he tried to understand why a simple signature was generating so much tension. "Actually," I said, addressing Colonel Harrison directly, "I'm discovering that important decisions about my inheritance have been made without my input, and I'm asking for time to review the legal documents before signing anything." Dad's face flushed red at my words. Having a family dispute play out in front of Dylan's commanding officer was clearly not part of their plan. He grabbed the manila folder from my hands and flipped it open to the signature page, stabbing his finger at the highlighted signature line. "Patsy, just sign the papers," he said, his voice rising despite his obvious effort to control it. "Everyone here knows you're doing the right thing. Stop making this more complicated than it needs to be." That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Dad had flipped the folder open to show me where to sign, but the page he was showing me didn't have the forged signature I'd discovered earlier. He was showing me a completely different copy of the document's one without the fraudulent signature. "Dad," I said slowly, "why do you have two different versions of these papers?" His face went white as he realized his mistake. Dylan immediately moved closer, trying to see what I was looking at, and I could see the moment he understood that their deception had been exposed. "That's just a rough draft," Dad stammered. "The lawyer gave us a practice copy so we could see what the final version would look like." But I was already reaching for the folder, trying to compare the two sets of documents. Dylan's hand clamped down on my wrist like a vice, preventing me from examining the papers more closely. "You're creating a scene," he hissed in my ear. "Everyone is watching. Just sign the paperwork and we can discuss any concerns you have privately later." The pressure of his grip was painful, and I could see several party guests beginning to notice that our family discussion had escalated into something more serious. Mrs. Johnson was whispering urgently to her husband while casting worried glances in our direction. "Let go of me," I said, pulling my wrist away from Dylan's grip. "And let me see both versions of these documents so I can understand what's actually being proposed." That's when Dad made his fatal mistake. In his panic about the situation spiraling out of control, he grabbed both sets of papers and tried to stuff them back into the manila folder. But in his haste, several pages scattered onto the ground at our feet. As I bent down to help gather the scattered papers, I saw something that made everything clear. The documents with my forged signature weren't rough drafts or practice copies. They were completed legal instruments ready to be filed with the county clerk's office. Dad and Dylan had been planning to steal my inheritance whether I cooperated or not. I stood up slowly, holding both sets of documents, and for the first time in months, I felt completely clear about what I needed to do. The scattered papers at my feet included not just the inheritance transfer paperwork, but also several other legal forms I didn't recognize. As I gathered them up, I realized Dad and Dylan had been planning an even more comprehensive scheme than I'd imagined. These documents have my signature forged on them," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet backyard. "My father and brother have been planning to file paperwork transferring my inheritance without my knowledge or consent." The reaction was immediate and electric. Colonel Harrison stepped forward with the kind of command presence that probably served him well in military crisis situations. Mrs. Johnson gasped audibly and grabbed her husband's arm. Dylan's military colleagues exchanged shocked glances, clearly understanding the serious legal implications of what I was describing. "That's not true," Dylan said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're misunderstanding what you're looking at." I held up the forged documents for everyone to see. "This is my grandmother's property transfer paperwork with my name signed on it in handwriting that isn't mine. I never signed these documents, and I never agreed to transfer my inheritance to anyone." Dad lunged forward, trying to grab the papers from my hands. "You don't understand the legal complexities involved," he shouted. "That's just preliminary paperwork to speed up the process once you made your decision." But I stepped back, keeping the evidence out of his reach. "Forging someone's signature on legal documents isn't preliminary paperwork, Dad. It's fraud." The word fraud seemed to electrify the assembled guests. Several of Dylan's military colleagues moved closer, their expressions serious and concerned. Colonel Harrison's face had taken on the stern look of someone evaluating a potential court-martial situation. "Captain Brennan," the colonel said formally, "I think we need to step away from this situation and allow your family to resolve this privately." But Dylan was panicking now, realizing that his military career could be destroyed by association with document fraud and family criminal activity. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on the aggression. "She's always been dramatic and selfish," he announced loudly, apparently hoping to discredit me before the truth could spread further. "She's been living in our parents' house rent-free while they struggle with medical bills, and now she's throwing a tantrum because we asked her to help with expenses. I've been paying $3,000 a month to support this household." I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I'm not unwilling to help my family. I'm unwilling to be defrauded by my family." That's when I noticed something else in the scattered paperwork. Mixed in with the inheritance documents were several official-looking forms from the Social Security Administration and the Department of Veterans Affairs. As I glanced through them, I realized Dad had been claiming disability benefits for his workplace injury, while apparently planning to use my inheritance money for major home improvements. But more disturbing than that were several invoices from construction companies for work that had apparently already been completed on the house. Roof repairs, furnace replacement, kitchen renovation. Thousands of dollars worth of improvements that Dad had somehow paid for despite supposedly being unable to afford basic medical expenses. "Dad," I said, holding up one of the invoices, "how did you pay for a $15,000 roof replacement if you can't afford groceries?" His face went pale as he realized I'd discovered another layer of their deception. Dylan immediately tried to deflect, but the damage was already done. Several guests had heard my question and were now looking around the property, noticing improvements they hadn't seen before. Mrs. Johnson spoke up from the crowd. "Martin, we thought you were struggling financially. How were you able to afford all these renovations?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Dad's mouth opened and closed several times as he tried to formulate an explanation that wouldn't implicate him in benefit fraud. Dylan stepped forward, apparently deciding that attack was their best defense. "You have no right to question our family's private financial decisions," he shouted at me. "You're embarrassing us in front of everyone with your selfish paranoia." But Colonel Harrison had heard enough. He moved between Dylan and me with the kind of protective authority that made it clear he wasn't going to tolerate any escalation of aggression. "Captain," he said firmly, "I strongly suggest you step back and reconsider your approach to this situation." That's when Dad completely lost control. Seeing his son's military career threatened and his financial schemes exposed in front of 50 witnesses, he made a decision that would destroy everything he'd been trying to protect. "This is my house," he roared, his voice carrying across the entire backyard. "I don't care what paperwork you think you found. You've been nothing but an ungrateful burden since you moved back here. You owe this family everything, and if you're too selfish to recognize that, then you don't deserve to be part of it." The venom in his voice shocked everyone into silence. This wasn't a stressed father having a difficult conversation with his adult daughter. This was pure rage and entitlement, the kind of explosive anger that had probably been building for months while I'd been supporting them financially. But what happened next would haunt me forever. Dad's eyes locked onto my phone, which I'd been unconsciously clutching throughout the entire confrontation. Something clicked in his expression as he realized I might have been recording the conversation or taking pictures of the forged documents. "Give me that phone," he demanded, reaching toward me with the kind of aggressive motion that made several party guests step backward in alarm. When I instinctively pulled my phone away from his grasping hand, protecting evidence of their fraud scheme, Dad's face twisted into an expression of pure hatred that I'd never seen before. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, and then his fist came flying toward my face with the force of 28 years of resentment behind it. The impact of Dad's fist against my cheekbone was like being hit by a sledgehammer wrapped in lightning. Pain exploded through my skull as I stumbled backward, my vision blurring with tears and shock. The metallic taste of blood flooded my mouth, where my teeth cut into the inside of my lip, and I could feel my face already beginning to swell. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of realizing that my own father had just punched me in the face in front of 50 people. The man who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with math homework had just assaulted me because I wouldn't let him steal my inheritance. Before I could even process what had happened, his calloused construction worker hands tangled in my hair, his fingers grabbing thick handfuls and twisting until tears sprang to my eyes from the scalding pain. He began dragging me across the backyard toward the front gate, pulling so hard that strands of hair ripped from my scalp. "You want to disrespect this family," he shouted as he hauled me past the shocked faces of our neighbors and Dylan's military colleagues. "You want to embarrass us in front of everyone, then you can get out of our house and stay out." My feet scrambled for purchase on the grass as he pulled me forward, my hands instinctively reaching up to try to loosen his grip on my hair. The humiliation was almost worse than the pain. 50 people were watching my father drag me across the yard like a disobedient child, and not one of them was moving to help me. That's when I heard Dylan's voice cutting through the horrified silence, and what he said made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. "That's right, Dad," he shouted, actually clapping his hands together in approval. "You had it coming, Patsy. Maybe this will teach you some respect for family." My brother, the newly promoted Army captain who was supposed to represent honor and service to his country, was cheering on my assault. He was encouraging our father's violence while his commanding officer and military colleagues watched in stunned horror. But what shattered my heart completely was looking around at the faces of the 50 guests and seeing nothing but frozen shock. Not one person moved to intervene. Colonel Harrison stood rigid with disbelief, his face pale but his feet planted firmly in place. Mrs. Johnson covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with horror, but she made no move to help me. Dylan's military colleagues, men and women trained in conflict resolution and sworn to protect civilians, stood motionless as they watched a domestic violence assault unfold right in front of them. Captain Rodriguez's mouth hung open in shock, but he didn't take a single step forward. Sergeant Martinez actually looked away, apparently unable to watch, but equally unwilling to intervene. Even Mom, my own mother who had given birth to me and raised me for 28 years, just stood frozen near the buffet table with her hands pressed against her face. She was watching her husband drag her daughter across the yard by her hair, and she chose to protect her relationship with Dylan over protecting her child from violence. The realization hit me like a second punch to the gut. Not only had my father and brother planned to defraud me, not only were they willing to assault me when I discovered their scheme, but 50 people who claimed to care about our family were going to stand there and watch it happen without lifting a finger to help me. As Dad dragged me past the buffet table, I caught sight of the scattered legal documents I'd dropped when he hit me. The forged inheritance papers were lying in the grass next to Mrs. Johnson's famous potato salad evidence of fraud and assault that would probably be cleaned up and thrown away before anyone thought to preserve it. But that's when I realized something that gave me the first spark of hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. My phone was still clutched in my right hand, and I could feel it vibrating with the familiar pattern that meant my emergency safety app had been activated by sudden movement and loud voices. 6 months earlier, after reading too many news stories about women being attacked by men, they trusted I downloaded a personal safety app that automatically started recording video and audio when it detected signs of potential violence. The app was designed to upload footage directly to cloud storage and send emergency alerts to designated contacts. Dad continued dragging me across the grass, his grip on my hair never loosening, his voice a constant stream of abuse about my selfishness and ingratitude. But with each step toward the front gate, my phone was recording everything. The assault, Dylan's encouragement, the cowardice of 50 witnesses, and most importantly, all the admissions of fraud and document forgery that had led up to the violence. When we finally reached the front gate, Dad released my hair with such force that I stumbled forward and nearly fell onto the concrete sidewalk. My scalp burned where he'd ripped out handfuls of hair, and I could taste blood from my split lip. But I was still alive, and I still had evidence of everything that had just happened. "Don't come back," he snarled, pointing his finger at me like I was a stranger who had wandered onto his property uninvited. "You're no longer part of this family. We don't need your drama, and we don't need your selfishness." Behind him, the party was resuming as if nothing had happened. I could hear Dylan's voice calling for everyone to continue celebrating his promotion, encouraging guests to help themselves to more food and drinks. Within minutes, the sound of conversation and laughter drifted from the backyard as 50 people decided that pretending nothing had happened was easier than confronting what they'd witnessed. I stood on the sidewalk outside my childhood home, my face throbbing with pain and my scalp burning from torn hair, and realized that I was completely alone. My family had betrayed me, assaulted me, and exiled me, and an entire community had chosen to look the other way rather than get involved in someone else's messy situation. But as I walked toward my car on unsteady legs, I felt my phone buzz with a notification that changed everything. The safety app had successfully uploaded 47 minutes of audio and video to my secure cloud account, and emergency alerts had been sent to my designated contacts. More importantly, the app's artificial intelligence had detected keywords related to fraud assault and document forgery, automatically flagging the recording as potential evidence of criminal activity. What Dad and Dylan thought was a private family matter that could be covered up and forgotten had been documented with crystal clear audio and high-definition video. They had no idea that their lives were about to be completely destroyed by the evidence they'd just helped me create. I sat in my Honda Civic at the end of the block, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely hold my phone steady. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed a split lip that was already swelling, and the beginnings of what would probably be a spectacular black eye. Strands of my auburn hair clung to my fingers, where Dad had ripped them from my scalp. Behind me, I could hear the party continuing as if nothing had happened. Laughter and conversation drifted through the evening air, punctuated occasionally by Dylan's voice telling stories about military life. 50 people had watched my father assault me and drag me from the house, and they were all apparently comfortable pretending it never occurred. The emotional numbness was almost worse than the physical pain. I'd spent 8 months sacrificing my independence and financial security to support my parents through Dad's medical crisis, and they'd repaid my generosity by planning to steal my inheritance and then assaulting me when I discovered their scheme. But as I sat there processing the betrayal, my phone kept buzzing with notifications from the safety app. Each alert brought new information about what the artificial intelligence system had detected and preserved from the confrontation. The first notification confirmed that 47 minutes of audio and video had been successfully uploaded to my cloud storage account, with backup copies automatically sent to 3 separate servers. Even if someone destroyed my phone, the evidence would be preserved permanently. The second notification was more detailed, explaining that the app's voice recognition software had detected multiple keywords associated with potential criminal activity: forged signature, fraud, disability benefits, stolen inheritance, and document forgery. The system had automatically flagged the recording for law enforcement review and created a detailed transcript of everything that had been said. But the third notification made my heart race with something that might have been hope. The app had detected that the incident occurred in the presence of multiple witnesses, and it had used my phone's GPS and nearby device detection to identify approximately 50 people who had been present during the confrontation. Their phone numbers and social media profiles had been logged as potential witnesses to the criminal activity. I opened the app and watched portions of the recorded video, hardly believing what I was seeing. The camera angle wasn't perfect since I'd been holding the phone at my side during most of the confrontation, but the audio was crystal clear. Every word of Dad and Dylan's fraud scheme was preserved in high-definition sound. More importantly, the recording captured Dad's admission about disability fraud. In his panic about being exposed, he'd started explaining to Dylan how he'd been collecting government benefits while working under-the-table construction jobs. The conversation included specific dollar amounts, dates, and details about falsified medical reports that could potentially result in federal criminal charges. The video also captured Dylan's enthusiastic participation in the inheritance fraud scheme and his celebration of the assault against me. His words about pressuring me in public and his clapping when Dad hit me would be devastating evidence in any military court-martial proceeding. But what shocked me most was reviewing the footage of the 50 witnesses. The app had captured clear images of Colonel Harrison Dillon's military colleagues, our neighbors and family friends, all standing motionless while I was being assaulted. Their faces showed horror and discomfort, but not one person had moved to help me or even called out for the violence to stop. As I scrolled through the witness identification data, I realized the full scope of what I'd inadvertently documented. This wasn't just evidence of assault and fraud. This was a complete record of a community's failure to protect someone from domestic violence, including military personnel who were specifically trained in intervention protocols. My phone rang, interrupting my review of the evidence. The caller ID showed emergency contact Sarah Thompson, and I remembered that Detective Thompson was one of the people I'd designated to receive automatic alerts from the safety app. Patsy. Sarah's voice was tight with concern. I just received an emergency alert from your phone indicating potential assault and fraud. Are you safe right now? Sarah Thompson had been 3 years ahead of me at Denver West High School, but we'd reconnected on social media and occasionally met for coffee when our schedules aligned. She'd joined the Denver Police Department after college and specialized in domestic violence and financial crimes investigation. I'm safe now, I managed to say, though my voice came out shaky and weak. But Sarah, something horrible just happened at my brother's promotion party. The app sent me preliminary audio samples, she said, her tone shifting into professional mode. I heard mentions of document forgery and witnessed assault. Do you need immediate medical attention or emergency response? I looked at my reflection again, taking stock of my injuries. The split lip was painful but not serious, and while my scalp was tender where Dad had grabbed my hair, I didn't think I needed emergency medical care. I don't think I need an ambulance, I said, but Sarah, I have evidence of some really serious crimes. Inheritance fraud, disability benefit fraud, document forgery, and assault, all recorded with multiple witnesses present. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice carried the kind of focused intensity that probably served her well in criminal investigations. Patsy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't discuss this with anyone else until I arrive. Don't post anything on social media, don't call other family members, and definitely don't delete anything from your phone. I'm 20 minutes away from your location, and I'm going to need you to walk me through everything that happened." As I waited for Sarah to arrive, I continued reviewing the recorded evidence and making notes about everything I could remember. The safety app had created an incredibly comprehensive record, including timestamps for each admission of criminal activity and facial recognition data for all the witnesses who had failed to intervene. But the more I studied the evidence, the more I realized that this case was going to be much bigger than a simple family dispute. Dad's disability fraud alone could result in federal charges and years in prison. Dylan's involvement as a military officer would trigger court-martial proceedings and potentially end his career. And 50 witnesses had just watched it all happen without lifting a finger to help. Detective Sarah Thompson arrived exactly 20 minutes later, driving an unmarked police sedan and wearing the kind of serious expression that told me she understood the gravity of what I'd described on the phone. She was a compact woman in her early 30s, with short blonde hair and the kind of direct gaze that probably intimidated suspects during interrogations. "Let me see your injuries first," she said, pulling on latex gloves and examining my split lip and the tender areas of my scalp where Dad had grabbed my hair. "We need to document everything for evidence purposes." She took detailed photographs of my face from multiple angles, paying special attention to the swelling around my left eye and the torn skin on my lower lip. When she examined my scalp, she found several small patches where hair had been ripped out, leaving tender red marks that she photographed carefully. "These injuries are consistent with assault and battery," she said, making notes in a small notebook. "The hair pulling could also support charges of unlawful restraint or kidnapping, depending on how the district attorney wants to proceed." While she documented my injuries, I walked her through everything that had happened, starting with overhearing Dylan and Dad planning their scheme that morning and ending with being dragged from the house in front of 50 witnesses. Sarah took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions about timeline-specific threats and the exact wording of various admissions. "Show me the recorded evidence," she said when I finished my account. I opened the safety app and played selected portions of the 47-minute recording. Sarah's expression grew more serious as she heard Dad and Dylan discussing their plans to pressure me into signing forged documents, and she actually winced when the audio captured the sound of Dad's punch connecting with my face. "This is incredibly strong evidence," she said, pausing the playback. "But Patsy, what you've uncovered here goes far beyond simple assault and inheritance fraud. Let me explain what I'm hearing in this recording." She pulled out her tablet and began taking notes as she outlined the various criminal charges that could potentially be filed based on the evidence I'd collected. "First, there's the obvious assault and battery charge against your father. That's a slam dunk with this video evidence and your documented injuries. Second, there's fraud and forgery related to your inheritance paperwork. Those forged signatures constitute multiple felonies." She continued scrolling through her notes. "But then there are the federal crimes. I heard your father admit to collecting disability benefits while working construction jobs under the table. That's Social Security fraud and potentially veterans benefit fraud if he's been claiming military disability compensation. We're talking about federal felonies that carry serious prison time." The scope of Dad's criminal activity was starting to become clear. What I'd thought was a recent scheme to steal my inheritance was apparently part of a much larger pattern of fraud that had been going on for months or possibly years. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I heard references to military equipment and supplies being used for personal construction projects. If your brother has been stealing government property to support your father's under-the-table work, that's theft of federal property and abuse of his military position." She looked up from her tablet with an expression that was part admiration and part concern. "Patsy, you've inadvertently documented what appears to be a comprehensive criminal enterprise involving multiple federal agencies. This is going to be a much bigger investigation than a simple family dispute." As Sarah continued analyzing the evidence, I started researching on my own phone and discovered additional information that made the situation even more serious. Property records showed that Grandma Rose's inheritance was actually worth significantly more than the $300,000 Dad and Dylan had mentioned in their scheming. Recent development in the rural area where the property was located had driven land values up dramatically. According to online real estate estimates, the 5-acre plot with the small ranch house was now worth closer to $500,000, potentially more if it was subdivided for residential development. Sarah, I said, showing her the property value estimates. They weren't just trying to steal $300,000 from me. This inheritance is worth $500,000 or more. She whistled softly as she reviewed the property information. That elevates the fraud charges significantly. Grand theft conspiracy to commit grand theft, potentially organized crime charges, if we can prove ongoing criminal enterprise. But the most shocking discovery came when Sarah ran Dad's name through law enforcement databases and discovered that this wasn't his first involvement with disability fraud. He'd been investigated 3 years earlier for similar activity, but the case had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. Your recording provides the evidence that was missing from the previous investigation, Sarah explained. The federal investigators are going to be very interested in reopening that case and adding new charges related to ongoing criminal activity. As we continued analyzing the evidence, Sarah received a text message that made her expression shift into something approaching amazement. I forwarded preliminary audio samples to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and they're requesting an immediate conference call, she said. Patsy, your father and brother have stumbled into something that multiple federal agencies have been investigating for months. The conference call with FBI agent Jennifer Martinez lasted over an hour and revealed that Dad and Dylan's criminal activity was part of a larger investigation into organized disability fraud and military equipment theft. Multiple suspects had been under surveillance, and my recorded evidence provided crucial missing pieces for several ongoing cases. Miss Brennan, Agent Martinez said through the speakerphone, "What you've documented tonight represents potentially dozens of federal felony charges across multiple suspects. We're going to need to move quickly to prevent destruction of evidence and flight risk." By the time Sarah and I finished our initial evidence review, arrest warrants were already being prepared for Dad and Dylan, along with several other individuals who had been mentioned in their recorded conversations. The scope of the investigation had expanded to include veterans benefit fraud, military equipment, theft, organized crime, conspiracy, and witness intimidation. But what gave me the greatest sense of validation was learning that my evidence would also trigger an investigation into the 50 witnesses who had failed to intervene during my assault. Several of Dylan's military colleagues could face disciplinary action for failing to report criminal activity, and the incident would become a case study in bystander responsibility and community intervention training. My phone call to Sarah had set in motion a chain of events that would bring justice not just for my assault and the attempted theft of my inheritance, but for a comprehensive criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. Within 2 hours of my initial call to Sarah, my kitchen table had been transformed into a command center for what Agent Martinez was already calling Operation Family Fraud. Sarah had been joined by FBI Agent Martinez, IRS Criminal Investigation Agent Robert Chen, and Veterans Affairs Inspector General Investigator Lisa Park. The coordinated response was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Each agency had specific jurisdiction over different aspects of Dad and Dylan's criminal activity, and they were working together to ensure that all potential charges were properly documented and filed. Agent Martinez took the lead on the inheritance fraud and assault charges, explaining that the forged documents and recorded admissions provided overwhelming evidence for multiple felony convictions. She'd already obtained warrants to search Dad and Dylan's phones, computers, and financial records. Your father's recorded admissions about disability fraud are going to open up a federal investigation that could involve dozens of other suspects, she explained. We've been tracking a network of construction workers who've been defrauding multiple benefit programs, and your evidence provides direct connections we've been missing for months. Agent Chen from the IRS was particularly interested in the financial aspects of the scheme. Dad's admission about receiving disability payments while working under-the-table construction jobs constituted tax evasion in addition to benefit fraud, and the agency was preparing to audit several years of tax returns. The property improvements you documented suggest significant unreported income. Agent Chen said, reviewing photographs of the roof replacement and kitchen renovation. We're estimating at least $60,000 in undeclared construction work over the past 2 years, which represents both benefit fraud and tax evasion. But it was Inspector General Park's information about Dylan's military involvement that shocked me the most. Her investigation had revealed that Dylan had been systematically stealing government equipment and supplies to support Dad's construction business, using his logistics position to redirect materials intended for base maintenance and construction projects. Captain Brennan has been falsifying inventory reports and shipping manifests for over 18 months, Inspector Park explained. Government property worth approximately $40,000 has been diverted to civilian construction projects, including work performed on your parents' house. The scope of their criminal enterprise was staggering. What I'd thought was a recent scheme to pressure me into signing over my inheritance was actually the latest phase of a sophisticated fraud operation that had been generating illegal income for years. But the most satisfying moment came when Sarah played portions of my recording for the assembled investigators, and they heard Dylan clapping and cheering when Dad assaulted me. The reaction from the law enforcement professionals was immediate and visceral. That level of callousness toward domestic violence is going to be devastating in court, Agent Martinez said grimly. Military court-martial proceedings take a very dim view of officers who celebrate violence against women, especially family members. Inspector Park nodded in agreement. The Uniform Code of Military Justice has specific provisions about conduct unbecoming an officer. Captain Brennan's behavior in this recording violates multiple articles and will likely result in dishonorable discharge even before we address the theft and fraud charges. As the evening progressed, the investigators built an increasingly comprehensive case against both Dad and Dylan. The recorded evidence was supplemented by financial records, construction permits, government property inventories, and witness statements from several of Dad's construction clients who had unknowingly received stolen military supplies. But perhaps the most crucial development came when Agent Martinez received confirmation that the property value estimates I'd found online were actually conservative. A professional appraisal ordered by the FBI valued Grandma Rose's inheritance at over $600,000 due to recent commercial development interest in the surrounding area. Your father and brother weren't just attempting inheritance fraud, Agent Martinez explained. They were planning grand theft of over $500,000 in real estate, which elevates this to the most serious category of property crimes. The financial analysis also revealed that Dad had been collecting approximately $1,800 per month in fraudulent disability payments while earning unreported income of $3,000 to $4,000 monthly from under-the-table construction work. Combined with stolen military equipment and materials, their criminal enterprise had generated over $200,000 in illegal profits. By midnight, arrest warrants had been issued for both Dad and Dylan, along with search warrants for their phones, computers, bank accounts, and the family house. Additional warrants were being prepared for several other individuals who had been identified as part of the broader fraud network. We're coordinating the arrests for 6 a.m. tomorrow, Agent Martinez informed me. Your father will be taken into custody at the house, and Captain Brennan will be arrested at his base by military police. We want to prevent any opportunity for evidence destruction or coordination between suspects. Sarah explained that I would need to testify before a grand jury within the next few weeks, but that the recorded evidence was so comprehensive that conviction was virtually guaranteed, even if Dad and Dylan decided to fight the charges rather than accept plea agreements. Patsy, Agent Martinez said as the investigators prepared to leave. I want you to understand the scope of what you've accomplished tonight. Your courage in documenting and reporting this criminal activity has not only protected your own inheritance, but potentially saved dozens of other victims from similar fraud schemes. The validation was overwhelming. 8 months of supporting my family financially had been repaid with planning to steal my inheritance assault in exile. But one phone call to someone who cared about justice had transformed me from victim to the catalyst for bringing down a comprehensive criminal enterprise. As I watched the law enforcement vehicles disappear into the night, I realized that Dad and Dylan's lives were about to be completely destroyed by the consequences of their own criminal choices. By morning, everything they'd built through fraud and theft would be in ruins. At exactly 6:15 the next morning, my phone rang with a call from Colonel Harrison. His voice was formal and carefully controlled, but I could hear underlying tension that suggested he'd been awake for most of the night thinking about what he'd witnessed at the party. "Miss Brennan," he said, "I want to inform you that Captain Dylan Brennan was arrested this morning by military police on charges related to theft of government property and conduct unbecoming an officer. I also want to personally apologize for my failure to intervene during yesterday's assault." The apology surprised me. I'd been prepared for anger or defensiveness from Dylan's commanding officer, but Colonel Harrison sounded genuinely ashamed of his inaction during the confrontation. "Sir, I understand that the situation was complicated," I replied, though part of me was still hurt by the memory of 50 people watching my assault without helping. "No, Miss Brennan, it wasn't complicated at all," he said firmly. "I witnessed a clear case of domestic violence and failed to intervene because I was more concerned about avoiding embarrassment than protecting a victim. That failure violated both my personal values and my military oath." Colonel Harrison explained that Dylan's arrest had triggered a comprehensive investigation into his logistics activities over the past 18 months. Military investigators had discovered systematic theft of construction materials, tools, and equipment that had been diverted to civilian projects, including work on Dad's house. "The inventory discrepancies we've uncovered suggest Captain Brennan stole government property worth approximately $40,000, the colonel continued. But more seriously, he falsified official reports and shipping manifests to cover up his thefts, which constitutes fraud against the United States government. The military investigation had also revealed that Dylan had been using his security clearance to access information about government construction contracts, which he then shared with Dad to help him underbid legitimate contractors for civilian projects. This intelligence theft added espionage-related charges to his growing list of criminal violations. But what made Dylan's situation truly hopeless was the recording of his reaction to my assault. Military justice took an extremely serious view of officers who celebrated violence, especially domestic violence against family members. "Miss Brennan," Colonel Harrison said, his voice heavy with disapproval, "I've reviewed the audio recording of yesterday's incident multiple times. Captain Brennan's applause and encouragement during your assault represents conduct that is fundamentally incompatible with military service. He will face court-martial proceedings on multiple charges, and I expect the outcome to be dishonorable discharge." The conversation also revealed that several of Dylan's military colleagues who had been present at the party were facing disciplinary action for failing to report criminal activity and domestic violence. Their training specifically required intervention in such situations, and their failure to act was being treated as dereliction of duty. "Captain Rodriguez and Sergeant Martinez have been suspended pending investigation," Colonel Harrison explained. "Military personnel are required to report and intervene in domestic violence situations, regardless of whether they occur on or off base. Their inaction violated direct orders and military regulations." But perhaps the most devastating blow to Dylan's military career came when Colonel Harrison revealed that the investigation had uncovered additional victims of his fraud schemes. Dylan had been systematically overcharging the military for supplies and services while providing substandard materials purchased with stolen government equipment. We've identified at least 6 separate incidents where Captain Brennan diverted military resources for personal profit, the colonel said. The total value of government property theft exceeds $50,000, and his fraudulent billing schemes cost taxpayers an additional $30,000. The military court-martial proceedings would happen in parallel with the civilian criminal charges, meaning Dylan faced the possibility of both federal prison time and military imprisonment. Even if he somehow avoided civilian conviction, the military evidence alone was sufficient to end his career and result in dishonorable discharge. Colonel Harrison also informed me that my recorded evidence had prompted a broader investigation into military logistics corruption at multiple bases. Dylan's theft methods had apparently been copied by other officers, and the FBI was now investigating a network of military personnel involved in government property diversion. Miss Brennan, your courage in documenting and reporting this criminal activity has exposed corruption that extends far beyond your family situation, he said. The military takes these violations very seriously, and we're committed to ensuring that all responsible parties face appropriate consequences. The conversation concluded with Colonel Harrison offering to provide a character reference for me in any legal proceedings and expressing his commitment to using this incident as a training example for other military personnel about the importance of intervention in domestic violence situations. After hanging up, I realized that Dylan's military career wasn't just over. It was being systematically dismantled as an example to other service members about the consequences of corruption and violence. His promotion to captain, which had been the occasion for yesterday's disastrous party, was being revoked, along with all privileges and honors he'd earned during his military service. The golden child, who had always been the family's pride and joy, was about to become a convicted felon with a dishonorable discharge facing years in federal prison for his theft and fraud schemes. His applause during my assault had been recorded and would be played in military courtrooms as evidence of conduct fundamentally incompatible with military service. By 10 o'clock that morning, local news stations were already reporting on the arrest of a military officer for government property theft and domestic violence-related charges. Dylan's mugshot appeared on television screens across Denver, destroying any remaining shred of the reputation he'd spent years building. By noon that same day, my phone had received 17 missed calls from various family members and friends who'd heard about the arrests through local news coverage or social media. The story of a military captain and his father being arrested for fraud and assault was spreading rapidly through our suburban Denver community. The first call I actually answered came from Dad's older brother, Uncle Tom, who lived in Colorado Springs, and had apparently been contacted by someone asking him to post bail for Dad's release from the county jail. "Patsy, what the hell is going on?" Uncle Tom demanded as soon as I picked up. "The news is saying Martin and Dylan were arrested for stealing your inheritance and beating you up. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding." I explained the situation as clearly as I could, but Uncle Tom's reaction was exactly what I'd expected from Dad's side of the family. He immediately began making excuses and suggesting that I was overreacting to what should have been handled as a private family matter. "Martin's been under tremendous stress with his injury and the medical bills," Uncle Tom said. "Maybe he lost his temper, but calling the police on your own family seems pretty extreme. Couldn't you have worked this out without destroying everyone's lives?" The suggestion that I was responsible for destroying their lives by reporting their crimes infuriated me, but I tried to keep my voice calm as I responded. "Uncle Tom, they forged my signature on legal documents to steal my inheritance. Dad hit me in the face, and Dylan cheered while it happened. This wasn't a family argument that got out of hand. This was planned criminal activity that escalated to assault when I discovered their scheme." But Uncle Tom wasn't interested in hearing about evidence or criminal charges. Like many family members faced with uncomfortable truths, he preferred to focus on maintaining family unity rather than addressing criminal behavior. Look, Patsy, I'm sure this whole thing can be resolved if everyone just calms down and talks reasonably. Maybe you could drop the charges and we can work out some kind of family agreement about the inheritance situation. I ended that conversation quickly and turned off my phone to avoid similar calls from other relatives who would inevitably pressure me to prioritize family loyalty over justice and personal safety. But the desperation of Dad and Dylan's situation became clear when Mom called me from a number I didn't recognize, apparently using a neighbor's phone since her own had probably been seized as evidence in the criminal investigation. "Patsy, honey, please." Mom's voice was thick with tears and barely controlled panic. "Your father and brother are in jail, and the lawyers are saying they could go to prison for years. The FBI agents took all our computers and financial records. They're talking about seizing the house and everything we own." For the first time since the assault, I felt a flicker of sympathy for Mom. She hadn't been directly involved in the fraud scheme, and while her failure to protect me during the assault was unforgivable, I could understand that watching her family disintegrate around her was devastating. "Mom," I said gently, "I didn't create this situation. Dad and Dylan chose to commit crimes, and they chose to assault me when I discovered what they were doing. The consequences they're facing are the result of their own decisions." But Mom wasn't calling just to seek comfort. As our conversation continued, it became clear that she was desperately hoping I would somehow make the criminal charges disappear by recanting my testimony or claiming the recorded evidence had been fabricated. "The lawyers say that without your testimony, the prosecution's case would be much weaker," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality that made me uncomfortable. "Honey, you know your father loves you. He was just stressed and scared about losing the house. Maybe if you talk to the prosecutors about dropping some of the charges, we could work out a payment plan for the inheritance." The suggestion that I should help Dad and Dylan escape consequences for assaulting me and attempting to steal my inheritance was so outrageous that I almost hung up immediately. But then Mom said something that revealed the full extent of their desperation. "Patsy, they've already spent money they don't have based on getting your grandmother's property. The roof repairs the kitchen renovation, the new furnace. They financed all of that expecting to pay it back with inheritance money. If you don't help them now, we're going to lose everything." The admission hit me like a physical blow. Dad and Dylan hadn't just planned to steal my inheritance. They'd already spent anticipated theft proceeds on home improvements, apparently confident that they could manipulate or coerce me into signing over Grandma Rose's property regardless of my actual feelings about the decision. "Mom, are you telling me that Dad went into debt based on money he planned to steal from me?" I asked, hardly believing what I was hearing. There was a long pause before Mom answered, and when she spoke, her voice was small and ashamed. "The contractors needed payment up front for the major work, and Martin was so sure you'd want to help family that he used the renovation contracts as collateral for loans. He thought once you saw how much the house improvements meant to us, you'd be happy to help cover the costs." The financial picture was becoming even more twisted than I'd realized. Dad had not only planned inheritance fraud, he'd committed loan fraud by using anticipated theft proceeds as collateral for legitimate construction loans. The contractors who'd performed work on the house were legitimate businesses who had no idea they were being paid with money obtained through criminal activity. But Mom wasn't finished revealing the full scope of their financial desperation. As she continued talking, she admitted that Dylan had also borrowed money against his expected share of the inheritance theft, using fraudulent financial statements to qualify for a car loan and personal credit lines. Dylan bought that new truck thinking he'd be able to pay it back once the inheritance was settled, Mom explained. He also put a down payment on a house near his base, planning to use inheritance money for the mortgage payments. The two men who had assaulted me and planned to steal my inheritance had already spent money they didn't have based on theft they hadn't yet completed. Their financial desperation explained the aggressive timeline of their fraud scheme, and their panic when I discovered the forged documents. "Mom," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, "Dad and Dylan spent money that never belonged to them based on stealing my inheritance. The fact that they're now facing financial consequences doesn't make me responsible for helping them escape the legal consequences of their crimes." The conversation ended with Mom sobbing into the phone and begging me to reconsider my cooperation with law enforcement. But her tears couldn't erase the fact that she'd chosen to stand by and watch while her husband assaulted her daughter rather than intervene to protect me. Within an hour of ending the call with Mom, I received text messages from both Dad and Dylan, apparently using other inmates' phone privileges to contact me from jail. Their messages revealed the complete collapse of their arrogant confidence from the previous day. Dad's text read, "Patsy, please help us. I made terrible mistakes and I'm sorry. If you drop charges, we'll sign over all rights to inheritance and pay you back for everything. Please don't let your family go to prison." Dylan's message was even more desperate. "I'm facing dishonorable discharge and federal prison. My entire military career is destroyed. Please tell prosecutors you want to handle this as family matter. I'll do anything to make this right." But their apologies and promises rang hollow after months of planning to defraud me, followed by assault when their scheme was exposed. More importantly, their text messages asking me to interfere with criminal prosecution constituted additional crimes of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. I forwarded all their messages to Detective Thompson, who confirmed that Dad and Dylan had just provided additional evidence for prosecutors to use against them. Their desperation was driving them to commit new crimes while they were already in jail awaiting trial for their original offenses. By Wednesday morning, our family's story had exploded beyond local Denver news into a viral social media phenomenon that I never could have anticipated. The combination of military corruption, family betrayal, and dramatic assault footage had created exactly the kind of story that captivated online audiences hungry for justice narratives. It started when someone at the party posted a brief video clip on social media showing Dad dragging me across the yard while Dylan clapped and cheered. The footage was shaky and didn't capture the audio, but it clearly showed an older man assaulting a younger woman while a uniformed military officer encouraged the violence. Within 24 hours, that video had been shared over 50,000 times, with comments expressing outrage at both the assault and the failure of party guests to intervene. People were particularly angry about Dylan's celebratory reaction, with many commenters expressing disgust that a military officer would encourage domestic violence. But the story gained national attention when someone identified Dylan's uniform and military rank, prompting questions about how an Army captain could participate in such behavior without facing immediate consequences. Military families across the country began sharing the video with demands for accountability and justice. The turning point came when a reporter from the Denver Post contacted Detective Thompson for information about the criminal charges, and Sarah provided enough details to confirm that this wasn't just a family dispute, but part of a larger fraud investigation involving military corruption and benefit fraud. "Local software engineer exposes military fraud ring after family assault" became the headline that launched our story into national news coverage. Major networks picked up the story, focusing on the intersection of domestic violence, military corruption, and the failure of bystanders to intervene. The media attention brought several unexpected developments that strengthened the criminal case against Dad and Dylan. First, 3 additional victims of Dad's construction fraud came forward after recognizing his name and photograph in news coverage. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, an elderly widow from a neighboring suburb, contacted police to report that Dad had charged her $12,000 for roof repairs, using what she now realized were stolen military materials. She'd paid the full amount up front and received substandard work that had already begun failing after only 6 months. Mr. James Cooper, a retired veteran, revealed that Dad had specifically targeted him for fraud by claiming military connections through Dylan's service. Dad had convinced Mr. Cooper to pay $15,000 for foundation repairs that were never properly completed, leaving his house with ongoing structural problems. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Maria Santos, a single mother who had hired Dad for home improvements using her deceased husband's military life insurance money. Dad had overcharged her by several $1,000s while using stolen government equipment, essentially stealing from a military widow and her children. The additional victims transformed the case from a family dispute into what prosecutors were calling a pattern of systematic fraud, targeting vulnerable populations. Dad's scheme hadn't been limited to stealing my inheritance. He'd been defrauding elderly people, veterans, and military families for months. But the media coverage also revealed shocking details about the party guests who had failed to intervene during my assault. A neighbor's security camera had captured the entire incident from a different angle, showing the faces of all 50 witnesses as they watched Dad drag me across the yard. The footage went viral with the hashtag 50Witnesses as people online expressed outrage that an entire community had stood by during a domestic violence incident. Several party guests were identified and began receiving angry messages demanding explanations for their inaction. Colonel Harrison's response to the media attention was particularly significant. Instead of trying to minimize military involvement in the scandal, he held a press conference taking full responsibility for his failure to intervene and announcing new training protocols for military personnel regarding domestic violence intervention. The failure of multiple military personnel to protect Miss Brennan during this assault represents a complete breakdown of our values and training, he said during the televised press conference. We are implementing immediate changes to ensure that our service members understand their obligation to intervene in domestic violence situations, regardless of the circumstances. The press conference also revealed that the military investigation had uncovered Dylan's involvement in a broader network of logistics corruption involving personnel at 3 different Army bases. What had started as a family fraud scheme had exposed systematic theft of government property across multiple military installations. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the media coverage was watching Dad and Dylan's reputations being systematically destroyed by their own recorded words. News stations played excerpts from my audio evidence, allowing viewers to hear Dad's admission of disability fraud and Dylan's celebration of domestic violence. The contrast between Dylan's polished military image and his recorded behavior was particularly devastating. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning his conduct, and several military advocacy groups called for maximum penalties to send a clear message about accountability in military leadership. Local businesses that had hired Dad's construction services began reviewing their contracts and demanding refunds after learning about his use of stolen materials. His reputation in the construction industry was completely destroyed, making it impossible for him to continue working even if he somehow avoided prison. The viral nature of the story also prompted investigations by other law enforcement agencies in neighboring states where similar fraud patterns were discovered among military contractors and logistics personnel. Dad and Dylan's scheme had apparently inspired or connected to fraud networks across multiple jurisdictions. By the end of the week, our story had been featured on 3 major network news programs and countless online platforms. The phrase 50 witnesses had become shorthand for community failure to protect domestic violence victims, and the incident was being used as a training example in law enforcement and social services programs across the country. The media attention was overwhelming and sometimes uncomfortable, but it also provided validation that the crimes committed against me were serious and deserving of public outrage. Dad and Dylan's assault and fraud weren't just family problems that should be handled privately. They were criminal acts that reflected broader societal issues requiring accountability and justice. The coordinated arrests happened exactly as Agent Martinez had promised at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, with law enforcement agencies working together to ensure that Dad and Dylan couldn't coordinate their stories or destroy evidence before being taken into custody. Dad's arrest at the house was captured by news cameras that had been stationed in our neighborhood since the story went viral. The footage showed FBI agents and local police executing search warrants while Dad was led away in handcuffs, his face a mixture of shock and humiliation as reporters shouted questions about fraud and assault charges. The search of the family house revealed even more evidence of criminal activity than investigators had expected. Dad's home office contained detailed records of his under-the-table construction work, including client lists, pricing calculations, and photographs of projects completed using stolen military materials. But the most damaging discovery was a notebook where Dad had been tracking his fraudulent disability payments alongside his illegal construction income. The handwritten records showed he'd been systematically defrauding multiple benefit programs for over 2 years, collecting approximately $45,000 in fraudulent payments while earning unreported construction income. The notebook also contained planning notes for the inheritance fraud scheme, including timelines for pressuring me to sign forged documents and contingency plans if I refused to cooperate voluntarily. Dad had written detailed psychological profiles of family members, analyzing who could be counted on to support their fraud and who might cause problems. Most chilling of all were notes about handling Patsy that suggested the assault hadn't been a spontaneous loss of temper, but part of a calculated plan to intimidate me into compliance. Dad had apparently considered various methods of coercion, including public humiliation and threats to my employment. Dylan's arrest at his military base was equally dramatic and embarrassing. Military police took him into custody during the morning formation in front of his entire unit and commanding officers. The public nature of his arrest was intentional, designed to send a clear message about accountability for military personnel involved in criminal activity. The search of Dylan's quarters revealed stolen government property worth over $15,000, including tools, construction materials, and electronic equipment that he'd been storing for Dad's construction projects. His computer contained emails detailing the logistics of their fraud scheme and communications with other military personnel involved in similar theft networks. But perhaps the most devastating evidence found in Dylan's possession was a detailed financial plan for spending my inheritance money. He'd created spreadsheets calculating how much they could steal from me, how it would be divided between family members, and what purchases they planned to make with the fraudulent proceeds. The financial planning documents showed that Dylan had already committed to major expenses based on anticipated theft of my inheritance. He'd put down payments on a house, a new truck, and vacation travel, all financed through credit agreements that listed the inheritance as collateral. When both Dad and Dylan were arraigned on their criminal charges, the courtroom was packed with reporters, victims of their fraud schemes, and community members who had followed the story through media coverage. Their mugshots appeared on local news broadcasts, completing the destruction of reputations they'd spent years building. Dad's charges included assault and battery document forgery, inheritance fraud, Social Security fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The total potential prison sentence exceeded 20 years if he was convicted on all counts, with additional financial penalties that could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. Dylan faced military court-martial proceedings in addition to civilian criminal charges. His military charges included theft of government property conduct, unbecoming an officer conspiracy, and violation of his oath of service. The civilian charges included conspiracy to commit fraud assault by encouragement and witness intimidation. But the most shocking revelation came during Mom's arrest the following day. The investigation had revealed that she'd been much more involved in the criminal enterprise than anyone had initially realized, including me. Financial records showed that Mom had been helping to launder money from Dad's construction fraud through fake household expense accounts and fraudulent loan applications. She'd also forged signatures on several government forms related to Dad's disability claims, making her an active participant in benefit fraud. Most devastating of all was the discovery that Mom had been intercepting mail related to Grandma Rose's inheritance, hiding legal notices and property information that should have been sent to me. Her actions had delayed the probate process and given Dad and Dylan additional time to plan their theft scheme. When Mom was led away in handcuffs, the image of my entire immediate family being arrested for criminal conspiracy was broadcast on national television. The complete collapse of what had once appeared to be a respectable middle-class family became a cautionary tale about how criminal thinking can corrupt entire households. The asset seizure process began immediately after the arrests, with federal agents freezing bank accounts and placing liens on property purchased with proceeds from fraud. The house I'd grown up in was scheduled to be sold to compensate victims of their crimes, including the elderly and military families they'd defrauded. But perhaps the most satisfying moment was when Dylan's new truck was repossessed in front of his military base, with local news cameras capturing the vehicle being towed away while his former colleagues watched. His financial planning based on stolen inheritance money had led to immediate consequences when the theft was exposed. The community reaction to the arrests was overwhelmingly supportive of my decision to report the crimes rather than handle them as a private family matter. Neighbors who had initially seemed uncomfortable with law enforcement involvement now expressed gratitude that a criminal enterprise operating in their midst had been exposed and stopped. Local veterans organizations issued statements condemning Dylan's abuse of his military position and expressing support for accountability measures that would prevent similar corruption. The American Legion post that had once honored Dylan's service formally revoked his membership and removed his photograph from their wall of distinguished veterans. The legal proceedings moved with remarkable speed once Dad and Dylan realized that the evidence against them was overwhelming and that fighting the charges would only result in harsher sentences. Within 6 weeks of their arrests, plea negotiations were underway that would spare them lengthy trials, but ensure serious consequences for their criminal activity. Dad's plea agreement required him to admit guilt to multiple federal felonies, including benefit fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. In exchange for his cooperation in identifying other members of the construction fraud network, he received a sentence of 3 years in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. The financial penalties were devastating to any hope Dad might have had of rebuilding his life after prison. He was ordered to pay full restitution to all fraud victims, including $45,000 in fraudulent disability payments, $30,000 to construction fraud victims, and an additional $50,000 in tax penalties and interest. The restitution calculations also included compensation to me for the attempted inheritance theft, emotional distress damages, and legal expenses. Even though Dad had never successfully stolen my inheritance, the attempt itself was valued at over $500,000 based on the property's current market value. But beyond the financial consequences, Dad's conviction resulted in permanent revocation of his construction license and placement on federal fraud databases that would prevent him from working in construction or applying for government benefits for the rest of his life. His criminal record would follow him forever, making employment difficult and destroying any remaining social reputation. Dylan's court-martial proceedings were even more dramatic and consequential. Military justice took an extremely serious view of his theft of government property and celebration of domestic violence, resulting in the maximum penalties allowable under military law. He was sentenced to 4 years in military prison reduction in rank to private forfeiture of all pay and benefits and dishonorable discharge. The dishonorable discharge was particularly devastating because it meant losing all veterans' benefits, educational assistance, and health care for the rest of his life. The civilian charges against Dylan resulted in additional prison time to be served concurrently with his military sentence, but the real punishment was the complete destruction of his military career and future prospects. His security clearance was permanently revoked, making him unemployable in defense-related industries. Most satisfying of all was the requirement that Dylan pay restitution for all stolen government property, plus additional penalties for his abuse of military position. The total financial judgment exceeded $90,000, money he would never be able to pay given his criminal record and dishonorable discharge status. Mom's involvement in the criminal conspiracy resulted in a lighter sentence due to her cooperation with investigators and her lesser role in planning the crimes. She received 2 years of probation community service requirements and restitution payments to fraud victims. But Mom's conviction still resulted in significant life consequences, including loss of her job as a school administrator, difficulty finding new employment with a criminal record, and social ostracism from the community where she'd lived for decades. The asset forfeiture proceedings resulted in the sale of the family house and all property purchased with proceeds from fraud. The house sold for enough money to cover most of the restitution payments to victims, but Mom was left effectively homeless and financially destitute. Perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the justice process was the victim impact statements that allowed people harmed by Dad and Dylan's crimes to directly address their suffering and demand accountability. Mrs. Walsh, the elderly widow defrauded by Dad's construction scheme, delivered a particularly powerful statement about the violation of trust involved in targeting vulnerable seniors. Mr. Cooper, the veteran who had been specifically targeted because of his military service, described the additional pain of being defrauded by people who claimed to understand military values. His testimony about financial hardship and ongoing home repair problems brought several jurors to tears. But my own victim impact statement was the moment when I finally felt complete closure and vindication for everything I'd endured. Standing in front of the packed courtroom with Dad and Dylan in prison uniforms at the defense table, I was able to describe not just the financial harm of their fraud scheme, but the emotional devastation of family betrayal and assault. The defendants didn't just attempt to steal my inheritance, I told the court. They destroyed my ability to trust family relationships and forced me to choose between my own safety and family loyalty. Their violence and fraud represent a complete rejection of the values they claim to support. I also described the ongoing impact of their crimes on my sense of security and family relationships. The knowledge that my own father and brother had been willing to assault me over money had fundamentally changed how I approached all close relationships. The judge's sentencing remarks emphasized that domestic violence and fraud within families was particularly serious because it violated the trust and safety that should characterize family relationships. He noted that Dad and Dylan's crimes represented a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable people, including family members, elderly neighbors, and military families. The defendants exploited their positions of trust and authority to systematically defraud people who should have been able to rely on their honesty and integrity, the judge said during sentencing. Their crimes represent not just individual bad acts, but a comprehensive rejection of community values and family responsibilities. The final financial accounting showed that victims of Dad and Dylan's criminal enterprise received full restitution through asset forfeiture and court-ordered payments. The elderly widow, the veteran, and the military widow all recovered their stolen money plus interest and penalties. My inheritance not only remained secure, but had increased in value during the legal proceedings, ultimately being worth over $600,000 when the probate process was finally completed. The money that Dad and Dylan had tried to steal through fraud and violence had grown beyond their wildest calculations of anticipated theft proceeds. 6 months after the arrests and convictions, the transformation in how our community viewed my decision to report family crimes was remarkable and deeply validating. What had initially been whispered criticism about airing family problems publicly had evolved into widespread recognition that criminal behavior requires legal accountability regardless of family relationships. The change began with a formal apology from Colonel Harrison, who organized a community presentation about domestic violence intervention and the importance of bystander action. The presentation was held at the same community center where many of the party guests were members, creating an opportunity for direct dialogue about their failure to help me. Miss Brennan's courage in documenting and reporting serious criminal activity exposed not just fraud and assault, but a community failure to protect someone in immediate danger, Colonel Harrison told the assembled crowd. We all witnessed domestic violence and failed to intervene, and that failure represents a betrayal of our shared values. The presentation included training on recognizing domestic violence, warning signs, and specific steps community members could take to intervene safely in dangerous situations. Several party guests attended and publicly apologized for their inaction, acknowledging that fear of social awkwardness should never prevent intervention in violent situations. Mrs. Johnson, our next-door neighbor, was particularly emotional during her apology. She explained that she'd been frozen by shock and uncertainty about whether family disputes were her business to address, but had since realized that assault is never a private matter regardless of family relationships. "I watched a young woman being hurt and did nothing to help her," Mrs. Johnson said through tears. "I failed as a neighbor, as a woman, and as a human being. I can never undo that failure, but I can commit to never standing silent again when someone needs help." The community accountability process also revealed positive changes in local domestic violence resources and intervention training. The police department began offering regular workshops on bystander intervention, and several local organizations coordinated to create better support networks for domestic violence survivors. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from other survivors of family violence, who reached out to thank me for demonstrating that reporting family crimes was both necessary and courageous. Many shared their own stories of being pressured to prioritize family loyalty over personal safety and legal accountability. A local domestic violence advocate named Jennifer Chen organized a support group specifically for people who had been assaulted or threatened by family members, and several women shared that my case had given them courage to seek help for their own situations. Seeing Patsy choose safety and justice over family approval showed me that I didn't have to accept abuse just because it came from relatives, said one group member during a community presentation about family violence. Her example helped me understand that protecting myself wasn't betraying my family. The advocacy work that grew from my experience became unexpectedly fulfilling and purpose-driven. I began speaking at law enforcement training sessions about the intersection of financial fraud and domestic violence, helping officers recognize that economic abuse often escalates to physical violence when victims resist. I also testified before the state legislature about the need for stronger protections against inheritance fraud and elder financial abuse. Dad's systematic targeting of elderly and military families had revealed gaps in existing law that made vulnerable populations easy prey for sophisticated fraud schemes. The legislative testimony was particularly satisfying because it allowed me to transform my personal trauma into policy changes that would protect other potential victims. The bill that resulted from our advocacy included stronger penalties for inheritance fraud and mandatory intervention training for professionals who work with elderly clients. My professional life also benefited unexpectedly from the public attention surrounding the case. Several technology companies reached out about consulting opportunities related to fraud detection and prevention software, recognizing my unique perspective on how financial crimes develop and escalate. The consulting work was rewarding both financially and personally because it allowed me to use my software engineering skills to build systems that could protect other people from the kind of fraud schemes Dad and Dylan had orchestrated. But the most profound change was in my understanding of family relationships and personal boundaries. The experience taught me that true family supports and protects each other, and that tolerating abuse or criminal behavior doesn't demonstrate love or loyalty. I established new relationships with extended family members who had condemned Dad and Dylan's actions and offered support during the legal proceedings. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who shared my values of honesty and accountability became my chosen family, replacing the relationships that had been destroyed by criminal behavior. The financial security provided by my inheritance also allowed me to purchase a beautiful home in a neighborhood where I felt safe and supported by community members who valued justice and mutual protection. The money that Dad and Dylan had tried to steal became the foundation for a life built on my own values and choices. 1 year after the assault, I organized a community appreciation dinner for the law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and advocates who had supported justice in my case. Detective Thompson, Agent Martinez, and Colonel Harrison were all honored for their professionalism and commitment to accountability. The dinner also included recognition for community members who had learned from their initial failure to intervene and had since become advocates for domestic violence prevention and bystander intervention training. The transformation from passive witnesses to active community protectors represented hope for systemic change. The media attention surrounding my case had also prompted policy changes in military training about domestic violence intervention and family fraud recognition. Dylan's case became a teaching example in military ethics courses about the consequences of criminal behavior and the importance of reporting misconduct. As I reflected on the year since Dad punched me at Dylan's promotion party, I realized that their violent attack on me had ultimately led to justice not just for me, but for many other victims and potential victims of similar crimes. Their criminal behavior had been exposed and stopped before it could harm additional vulnerable people. 2 years have passed since that horrific night when Dad's fist connected with my face and shattered not just my sense of family safety, but my entire understanding of loyalty justice and what it means to truly protect the people you love. Today, as I sit in the living room of my beautiful new home surrounded by photographs of my chosen family and awards from domestic violence organizations, I can honestly say that the worst night of my life led to the most meaningful and purposeful years I've ever experienced. The inheritance that Dad and Dylan tried to steal through violence and fraud became the foundation for a life I never could have imagined. The $600,000 property has been developed into a small residential community that provides affordable housing for domestic violence survivors and their children. Every month, families move into safe, beautiful homes built on land that criminals thought they could simply take from me. My work as a consultant specializing in fraud prevention software has grown into a company that employs 12 people and serves law enforcement agencies across 3 states. We've developed systems that have helped identify and stop financial fraud schemes, similar to the one my family orchestrated protecting vulnerable elderly and military families from predators who target their trust and resources. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of my new life is the advocacy work I do with domestic violence survivors who are struggling with family pressure to drop charges or handle criminal behavior privately. Every week I speak with women and men who are being told that protecting themselves from family violence somehow makes them disloyal or vindictive. What I learned, I tell them, is that real family protects you from harm, not causes it. Real love supports your safety and well-being, not your silence about crimes. When someone hurts you and then demands your protection from consequences, they're not asking for family loyalty. They're asking for permission to keep hurting you. The justice that was served in my case created ripple effects that continue to benefit countless other people. Dad remains in federal prison where his health problems have worsened considerably due to the stress of incarceration and his inability to access the medical care he was fraudulently claiming to need. His construction business is permanently destroyed, and he'll never again be able to exploit vulnerable families seeking affordable home repairs. Dylan was released from military prison last month after serving his full sentence, but his dishonorable discharge and criminal record have made him essentially unemployable in any meaningful career. He's living in a halfway house and working temporary warehouse jobs, a dramatic fall from the military leadership position he'd once used to steal government property and abuse his authority. Most importantly, both of them have been permanently barred from contact with me through restraining orders that will be in effect for the rest of their lives. They lost the right to be part of my family when they chose criminal behavior over love and respect. Mom completed her probation successfully and has been trying to rebuild her life, but our relationship remains severed due to her choice to prioritize Dylan's approval over protecting me from assault. Some betrayals are simply too fundamental to forgive, and watching your daughter being dragged across a yard by her hair without intervening is one of them. The 50 witnesses who stood frozen during my assault have had varying responses to their failure. Some, like Mrs. Johnson and Colonel Harrison, have become passionate advocates for bystander intervention training and have used their experience to help others learn from their mistakes. Others have remained defensive and uncomfortable about their inaction, apparently preferring to forget the incident rather than confront their failure to help someone in immediate danger. But even their discomfort serves a purpose by demonstrating that ignoring violence has lasting consequences for witnesses as well as victims. The criminal investigation that began with my family's fraud scheme ultimately led to prosecutions of 17 other individuals involved in similar theft and benefit fraud networks. Military personnel at 5 different bases were arrested for property theft, and dozens of elderly and veteran families recovered money that had been stolen through construction fraud schemes. Detective Sarah Thompson was promoted to lieutenant based partly on her excellent work in my case, and she now heads a specialized unit that investigates financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. Agent Martinez received a commendation for her coordination of the multi-agency investigation that exposed the broader criminal network. But the most meaningful recognition came from the Colorado Coalition Against Domestic Violence, which honored me with their annual Courage Award for demonstrating that family relationships don't excuse criminal behavior and that justice requires accountability regardless of personal cost. The award ceremony was attended by dozens of other survivors who had found the strength to report family violence and financial abuse after learning about my case through media coverage. Seeing their faces and hearing their stories of liberation from toxic family dynamics reminded me that speaking truth to power creates permission for others to do the same. As I've learned to build healthy relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care, I've discovered what real family actually looks like. It's found in friends who celebrate your successes without jealousy, colleagues who support your professional growth, and community members who protect each other from harm. Real family doesn't ask you to choose between your safety and their approval. Real family doesn't plan to steal your inheritance and assault you when their scheme is discovered. Real family celebrates your achievements instead of plotting to exploit your generosity. The phone call I made to Detective Thompson that night transformed my life from victim to survivor to advocate, but it also protected countless other potential victims from the criminal enterprise that Dad and Dylan had been operating. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for harmful behavior, even when those people are family members who claim their crimes were motivated by desperation or family loyalty. What I want everyone who hears this story to understand is that you don't owe anyone permission to hurt. You steal from you or treat you as less than human, regardless of your family relationships or shared history. Your safety, your dignity, and your right to justice matter more than maintaining family peace or avoiding uncomfortable confrontations. If someone in your family is hurting you financially, emotionally, or physically, you have the right to protect yourself through legal means and community support. Don't let anyone convince you that family loyalty requires accepting abuse or criminal behavior. And if you ever witness someone being hurt, especially by family members, please don't assume it's not your business or that family disputes should be handled privately. Violence is never private, and your intervention could save someone's life or prevent additional victims from being harmed. The courage to speak up and seek help isn't betraying your family. It's protecting yourself and others from people who have chosen to betray the fundamental values that should define family relationships: love, respect, protection, and support. My story began with the worst betrayal I could have imagined, but it led to a life filled with purpose, justice, and relationships built on genuine care and mutual protection. Sometimes the most devastating endings become the most beautiful new beginnings. Call to action. Have you or someone you know ever faced the difficult choice between family loyalty and personal safety when dealing with criminal or abusive behavior from relatives? How did you navigate the pressure to stay silent about crimes committed by people you're supposed to love and trust? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories could help other people who are struggling with similar decisions find the courage to protect themselves and seek justice. Please like this video if my story resonated with you, or if you believe in the importance of holding family members accountable for criminal behavior. Subscribe to my channel for more content about justice healing and building healthy relationships after family trauma. And please share this story with anyone who might benefit from hearing that choosing safety and justice over family approval isn't selfish or vindictive. It's necessary for creating a world where vulnerable people are protected from those who would exploit family relationships for criminal gain. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting survivors who have found the strength to speak truth to power. I wish you safety, justice, and relationships filled with genuine love and respect. Remember, you deserve to be treated with dignity and kindness, especially by the people who claim to love you most.